The Legend of Zelda is one of the most iconic and storied franchises in gaming history, but I have to admit, it's a franchise I don't have a ton of personal experience with. The first Zelda game that I ever owned was Twilight Princess, and since then, I've only ever beaten one additional title. Looking to fill in one of my biggest blind spots, I've decided to knock a few more entries off my backlog, but even something seemingly as simple as choosing a starting point can seem a little intimidating with a series as celebrated as Zelda. Conventional logic might dictate going with A Link to the Past or Ocarina of Time, which are often seen as high points, but with Wind Waker celebrating the 20th anniversary of its North American release this year, I thought it was the perfect excuse to start my quest with one of the most divisive entries in the series. The best illustration of this has to be the reaction to the reveal of Twilight Princess at E3 2005, which reportedly left many of the journalists in attendance weeping with joy. That might seem like a pretty big overreaction, considering the previous game had only released 2 years earlier, but to a lot of the fan base, Twilight Princess was the game they'd been waiting for ever since 2000, when Nintendo first showcased the possibilities of a then next-gen Zelda. A lot of people had grown up with Zelda, and in many ways Zelda had grown up with them. The previous 3 entries had all gotten darker and darker, so to many, the cel-shaded art style for Wind Waker was seen as regression. And it didn't help that by the time Wind Waker did release, it was obvious that the Gamecube wasn't going to be able to recreate the success of some of Nintendo's previous home consoles, with the dominance of the PS2 and the emergence of the Xbox largely driven by more mature titles like GTA and Halo. Wind Waker, with its cutesy aesthetic, sort of became a lightning rod for everything people thought was wrong with Nintendo at the time. Now, as someone who didn't own a Gamecube during its heyday, I never understood those criticisms. Wind Waker has always been a game that I've wanted to play in large part due to its art style. I mean, just look at the damn thing. If you aren't charmed by the whole chibi Pixar vibe going on, I just feel bad for you because you clearly have no soul. Despite its reputation for being underpowered and the storage limitations imposed by the many DVDs, I've always thought Nintendo's little purple lunchbox was home to some of the most impressive looking games from its era, and Wind Waker just might be the best of the bunch. The game is an absolute joy to behold in motion, serving as a testament to the power of great visual art design and animation. There's so many minor touches a lot of people won't even notice that really help bring it all to life, such as how Link's expression switches to one of pure determination when he's using the iron boots to tread his way through overpowering wind or climbing up a rope. In an industry that's so heavily driven by technical innovation and often leads to once cutting-edge titles quickly find themselves looking dated, the way that Nintendo managed to create such a truly timeless style that legitimately holds up next to modern releases is beyond impressive. Now, even most people with only casual knowledge of the Zelda franchise like myself knows the basic plot that most of these games follow. Some evil dickhead named Ganon, or Ganondorf depending on his mood, desires a mystical item called the Triforce to acquire its power, and when Princess Zelda learns of his scheme, she recruits Link to help put a stop to it. So I was surprised to learn that Wind Waker actually strays somewhat from the formula I'd been expecting. Yeah, Ganon is up to his usual shit, and Link does turn out to be the hero of legend, but his initial motivations here are more personal, as he starts off simply looking to rescue his sister, who's been kidnapped by the Ganon bird. Zelda doesn't even know she's Zelda, instead assuming the identity of the pirate Tetra, and she takes far more of an active role in the story, instead of just hiding out in a castle and being kidnapped. Well, you know, at least until she learns that she is Zelda, at which point she just hides out in the castle until she gets kidnapped, but she does manage to redeem herself at the end. It's also worth pointing out that this is a somewhat darker game than its cutesy, family-friendly visuals might lead you to believe. Yeah, everybody always talks about how Link straight up plants the Master Sword into Ganon's dome, and that's fair, as it's probably the most graphic moment we've ever seen in a game made by Nintendo, but nobody ever talks about how it's revealed that Ganon straight up murdered the previous sages. The ending to the game is also pretty bittersweet and touches on themes of leaving behind something worthwhile for future generations. Again, this is a Nintendo game, so there's nothing here that's truly inappropriate for children, but Wind Waker isn't just the lighthearted adventure it might appear at first glance. But it wasn't just the art style that's led a few Zelda fans to disown Wind Waker. See, with the realm of Hyrule having been submerged in a massive flood years before the game kicks off, Wind Waker takes place in the Great Sea, and with the bulk of the map covered with water, Link traded in his trusty steed Epona for a sentient boat called the King of Red Lions. Now, sailing around the Great Sea is a visual treat, and when Wind Waker is at its best and you just pick a direction and go, it provides a thrill of discovery that few games can match. Combat isn't really difficult, but it is enjoyable, and thanks to Link's parry ability, it's pretty flashy, while just spamming your sword is usually enough to get you through most encounters. A few enemies do require you to utilize specific tools or slightly more advanced tactics. The same philosophy also applies to the dungeons. There aren't any puzzles that are gonna stump you. Pretty much everything you need to do to progress is clearly signaled for you, but utilizing all of Link's items to make your way through these areas is still a lot of fun. I've heard complaints that Wind Waker is too easy, but in my limited experience with the series, I don't recall any of the other games being all that challenging. Well, aside from the original, which had that old school fuck you 8-bit mentality. You're not going to get the same satisfaction from beating a boss in Wind Waker that you would in Dark Souls, but the charm and sheer fun factor is more than enough to carry it through. Unfortunately, there were a number of issues which did impede my enjoyment of it. The most common complaint you always heard, well aside from the art style, was just how often you had to redirect the damn wind. The first few times you play the Wind's Requiem, it's pretty neat, but by the 50th it loses its novelty and actually begins to discourage exploration. Half the time I saw something in the distance, I just couldn't be bothered to redirect the wind to actually check it out. Also, every time I try out a Zelda game, I feel like I'm forced to pause the action and deal with my inventory more often than I like, and that problem has never been more prevalent than when I'm sailing around in Wind Waker. I was constantly cycling through bait, the grappling hook, the Wind Waker, and my various weapons. On the upside, I now appreciate games that feature an item wheel more than ever before. Speaking of weapons, ship-to-ship combat is kind of terrible, which is pretty shocking given how much emphasis is placed on sea travel. It's extremely boring, and if you get shot by a cannon, chances are you're going to find yourself stuck in a short loop where you just get shot in the face every time you get back into your boat. I found the best strategy was just to pull up right behind an enemy ship and just blast them right in the ass. It's also pretty annoying in the early part of the game to get to an island only to discover that you don't yet have the required skill or item to access its goodies. This was a pretty big issue because most of these islands only have one or at most two activities, so when you arrive at a destination only to realize that you can't actually do anything, it's pretty shitty and makes you feel like you wasted your time. But what's worse is when the game leads you to believe that the item needed to access something is actually available when it's really not. One of the first locations I discovered was Fire Mountain, and the fishman there told me I need an item that could freeze and pointed me in the direction of the Mother and Child Islands. When I arrived there, I learned that the only way to speak to the fairy was to ride one of the cyclones. So I rode my ship into one of the ones that were nearby, where I'm confronted by one of the wind gods, who threw me halfway across the map before the King of Red Lion suggests that beating the god will allow me to use his cyclones and tells me that I'll need a bow to do so. So I finally break down and look up online how to get the bow, and it turns out it's a story item you receive from one of the dungeons. So that was roughly 45 minutes or so wasted just because I wanted to check out something that looked pretty cool. I'll admit, after this, I really didn't spend too much time wandering off the beaten path until the King of Red Lions told me to track down the sages and gather the various pieces of the Triforce, as by that point I had the tools to deal with like 90% of the obstacles I'd come across. And I guess that brings me to the Triforce hunt. Honestly, the hunt itself wasn't too bad. I mean, tracking down the charts just to then have to track down the pieces does seem like busy work that was added in just to make the game seem longer, but the incredible chart makes it easy, and luckily I had the foresight to split the hunt up between the two temples, which did cut down the monotony that I could easily see setting in if I'd saved all 8 pieces for the very end. Honestly, the biggest issue for me was just saving up the money I needed to get that greedy asshole Tingle to decipher the last 3 charts. As I'm able to tell from my health bar, I'm not exactly a completionist, so I pretty much just ignored most of the treasure charts for most of the game, and it did come back to bite me in the ass a bit. There's also a bunch of little quirks that just needlessly slow things down, like why can't I have Tingle decipher every Triforce map I have on me at once? Why does the game feel the need to explain what a fairy does when it just gave me the exact same information 5 seconds ago? And why do I have to engage in a conversation with this shopkeeper before I can actually start buying stuff? Individually, this might not seem like much, but it adds up. Now, I don't want to seem like I hated my time with the Wind Waker. I actually really enjoyed it, and this playthrough did leave me excited to work my way through more of the series. There's a certain childlike innocence and magic to Wind Waker that can make even the most jaded and cynical asshole like myself feel like a little kid again, despite not actually having any nostalgia for it. I know Nintendo followed it up on the DS, but it's baffling to me that they never made a sequel on consoles. It might not have executed all of its ideas perfectly, but the foundation established here could be built upon to provide a truly legendary experience. I give The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker 10 bone-chilling zombie screams out of 12.